In Earth City, Missouri, late November isn't just cold, it's still. A kind of stillness that feels deliberate, pressing down on the industrial blocks and empty lots that line the Mississippi River. Factories wind down before the holidays. Office lights flicker out before sunset. And in one parking lot beneath the last working floodlight, a silver sedan sat motionless. Engine off, doors locked, no driver. No one noticed at first. Beverly Guenther's routine never changed. She clocked out around the same time every evening, drove the same route home, parked in the same spot. People like her, with structured lives, stand out when they break pattern. So when her car remained in the lot long past dark on November 20th, 2003, it caught attention. At first, passing curiosity, then concern. Beverly didn't miss work. She didn't leave her car behind. A colleague, failing to reach her by phone, drove back to the office that evening. The building was locked, lights off, but Beverly's car, immobile, remained. The coworker circled it twice, noting the thin layer of frost beginning to creep across the windshield. The hood was cold. Beverly's purse and phone weren't visible inside, but that car never stayed there overnight. When the police were finally called, there was no urgency in the dispatcher's voice. Missing persons reports in adults didn't trigger immediate red flags, especially for someone in her 40s. But the officer who responded to the scene noted the detail plainly. The driver's seat positioned forward, the passenger door unlocked, no sign of forced entry or struggle inside. Beverly Guenther, 45, wasn't just gone. She had vanished between the close of business and the first frost settling on the car roof. There was no sign of where she'd gone or why. Her phone, later found inside her locked office, showed no outgoing calls after 6:23 p.m., a timestamp that quickly became critical. Case file summary. Victim, Beverly Guenther, female, 45 years old. Last seen, 6:15 p.m., November 20th, 2003, Earth City, Missouri. Vehicle, silver sedan, parked at employer's lot, engine off, passenger door unlocked. Personal effects, cell phone recovered inside office. Handbag not located. Investigators began with the obvious, Beverly's known history. She wasn't estranged from family. Her routine was predictable, but more importantly, she had filed a restraining order earlier that year. A former boyfriend, Scott McLaughlin, male, 30s, known for violating boundaries. Restraining orders are lines in the sand. They're not bulletproof. They exist in ink on paper. For Beverly, that line had already been crossed before. Multiple reports detailed McLaughlin appearing unannounced at her workplace, calling repeatedly despite her pleas to stop. Her coworkers knew the history, remembered her saying she felt watched, even stalked. But feeling watched and going missing are two different categories of threat. Initial leads, no signs of forced entry at the scene. Vehicle status suggests voluntary departure or coercion. No immediate witnesses. Forensic analysis of the vehicle revealed minimal trace evidence. No hair fibers, no fingerprints out of place. The frost covering the car preserved it as it had been left. But near the rear passenger side tire, faint impressions in the gravel caught attention. Not footprints. Drag marks. Subtle, barely defined, but inconsistent with regular foot traffic. No blood, no violent scuffle. Just traces that suggested Beverly hadn't walked away from that lot. When officers interviewed her coworkers, one repeated a specific detail. Beverly had received a voicemail around midday that left her visibly shaken. She didn't play it for anyone. The message had been deleted, but phone records showed it came from McLaughlin's number. The tone of the investigation shifted. This wasn't a cold trail, it was warm, too warm. Officers paid a visit to Scott McLaughlin that night. He answered the door at his residence, outwardly calm, stating he hadn't seen Beverly in weeks. His alibi, vague at first, firmed under questioning. He'd been home all evening, alone, a missing woman, a silent car, a man with a history of ignoring boundaries. But without hard evidence, suspicion wasn't enough. Digital forensics angle, Beverly's phone records end abruptly at 6:23 p.m. No outgoing calls. Last known text message sent 2 hours prior. Brief, non-alarming, confirming a work detail. Voicemail records incomplete. Critical message deleted. Investigators secured a warrant to retrieve deleted data from Beverly's phone carrier, hoping to recover that voicemail. Forensics combed through her apartment. No signs of disturbance, no indication she packed for an extended absence. Her purse missing. Drag marks in gravel, no physical struggle. A voicemail that couldn't be played. By the end of that first night, Beverly wasn't officially a homicide victim, but unofficially the detectives treated the case as though she were. Earth City had seen disappearances before, temporary lapses, people leaving town for personal reasons. But nothing about this fit that mold. And that voicemail, the one she deleted before leaving work, held the weight of something more. By the morning after Beverly Guenther's disappearance, the focus of the investigation shifted sharply. Missing persons became potential foul play. The evidence remained sparse, but context mattered. Beverly wasn't just anyone. She had documented threats, a restraining order, and a history of harassment. Those facts elevated her case, and the name Scott McLaughlin moved from background detail to investigative priority. Detectives began with procedural groundwork. They mapped Beverly's last known movements. She had left work late afternoon on November 20th, her final known communication a text message sent at 4:19 p.m., routine in content. By 6:23 p.m., her phone activity ceased entirely. The voicemail she received earlier that day, deleted from her device, remained unrecovered at this stage. That gap, from the routine text to the silence, framed the investigative window. Surveillance coverage at Beverly's workplace was limited, an older system, fixed angles, low resolution. Reviewing the footage from that night, detectives identified minimal vehicle traffic after sunset. One vehicle, a dark sedan, passed through the lot near 7 p.m., headlights sweeping over the parked cars before exiting. Due to poor image quality, the plate was unreadable. The make and model could not be confidently determined. However, investigators noted the vehicle's behavior. It slowed near Beverly's car but didn't stop. Forensic teams revisited the gravel lot that morning, focusing on the faint drag marks initially observed near Beverly's rear passenger side tire. Ground conditions were dry, temperatures below freezing. No new disturbances were noted. The marks extended approximately 6 feet toward a grassy verge leading to an access road. There was no continuation of those tracks into the grass. This indicated either the victim or an object had been moved partially, but no further evidence of direction or destination could be established from the ground pattern alone. Attention returned to Scott McLaughlin. A background check revealed 2 key incidents beyond the restraining order. First, a 1992 conviction for sexual assault involving a minor, resulting in registry as a sex offender. Second, multiple police reports from earlier in 2003 for violating the restraining order Beverly had filed, including unwanted visits to her workplace and residence. On November 21st, McLaughlin voluntarily attended an interview at the police station. He maintained he hadn't seen Beverly in several weeks, claiming he spent the evening of November 20th alone at home. No witnesses corroborated this alibi. His demeanor remained calm, cooperative on the surface. During the interview, detectives inquired about the deleted voicemail from the afternoon of Beverly's disappearance. McLaughlin admitted to calling her that day but stated he left a generic message, offering to talk and clear the air. When pressed on whether that message could be recovered, he appeared indifferent. Digital forensics escalated at this stage. Investigators requested metadata and deleted records from Beverly's mobile carrier, aiming to retrieve the voicemail. The process required legal clearance but was prioritized, given the circumstances. Voicemail recovery timelines varied, but if successful, this could be a pivotal point. In parallel, detectives canvassed McLaughlin's neighborhood. A neighbor reported seeing McLaughlin's car, a dark-colored sedan, absent from his driveway between 6 o'clock and 9 p.m., the night Beverly vanished. This conflicted directly with his alibi. Vehicle records confirmed McLaughlin owned a black 1997 Honda Accord. The make and model aligned with the vehicle observed on the grainy surveillance footage from Beverly's lot. However, without clearer imagery or a license plate, this correlation remained circumstantial. Detectives returned to McLaughlin's residence that afternoon with a warrant. His vehicle was parked outside. A cursory visual inspection revealed no immediate signs of disturbance, no visible blood, no obvious damage. The car was impounded for a full forensic sweep, focusing on interior fibers, fluids, and soil traces. Forensic angle vehicle analysis initiated. Impounded vehicle, black 1997 Honda Accord. Primary objectives: luminal testing for latent blood, fiber analysis, soil sample comparison with Beverly's worksite. Simultaneously, Beverly's workplace surveillance footage was cross-referenced with traffic camera feeds from nearby intersections. While direct angles on her office parking lot were limited, footage from an adjacent access road recorded a dark sedan heading north around 7:12 p.m. This vehicle, while consistent in size and color with McLaughlin's Accord, was too distant for confirmation. No additional footage captured Beverly leaving on foot or in another vehicle. Her car remained stationary the entire evening. 2 days after Beverly Guenther vanished, the black 1997 Honda Accord, belonging to Scott McLaughlin, sat in an evidence garage under controlled lighting. The initial visual inspection had yielded no immediate leads, but in forensic investigation, the absence of obvious evidence does not end the search. It redirects it. The vehicle's interior and exterior were cataloged in detail, every fiber, stain, and trace logged for further analysis. The focus shifted to latent biological evidence. Using luminol, forensic technicians swept the interior, paying close attention to the trunk space, floor mats, and door handles. No overt bloodstains were visible, but luminol revealed faint, irregular fluorescence in the trunk area, patterns suggestive of blood transfer rather than pooled spatter. The shapes were inconsistent with a fresh wound or active bleeding, but matched what might be left behind by the movement of an object or body. Technicians collected swabs from these areas, submitting them for DNA analysis against Beverly Guenther's known profile. Concurrently, fiber samples taken from the trunk lining were cross-referenced with fibers from Beverly's clothing, which had been previously gathered from her workplace and vehicle. Soil analysis began in parallel. The vehicle's undercarriage and wheel wells were scraped for residual material. The composition of soil embedded in the treads, silt-heavy mixed with clay, matched the specific environmental conditions near the Mississippi River, aligning with the drag marks found at Beverly's workplace. This detail, while circumstantial, began to thread the vehicle into the narrative of her disappearance. As these tests progressed, digital forensics delivered a critical development. Beverly's phone carrier successfully retrieved the deleted voicemail from November 20th. The message was brief, under a minute. The voice was calm, measured. McLaughlin's words were recorded plainly. "We need to talk. I know you're scared, but I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to make things right." The content alone didn't confirm intent to harm, but paired with Beverly's prior restraining order and her co-workers' observations of fear, it deepened the significance of the message. Context elevated it beyond benign. Investigators requested McLaughlin's cell phone records for the night Beverly vanished. While McLaughlin initially claimed he stayed home, his mobile activity suggested otherwise. Between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m., his device registered multiple pings from cell towers near Earth City and adjacent riverfront areas. The pattern contradicted his assertion of remaining at his residence during the evening. A subpoena was issued for GPS data from McLaughlin's vehicle, focusing on any recent service logs or navigation history. Though the car's model year predated built-in GPS tracking, investigators looked to cross-reference McLaughlin's phone location data with traffic camera placements, reconstructing his potential routes. On November 23rd, preliminary DNA results returned. The luminol-positive samples collected from the trunk of McLaughlin's vehicle tested positive for human blood. The genetic profile was partial but consistent with Beverly Guenther's known DNA markers. This confirmation shifted the case framework definitively. What began as a missing persons case now had physical evidence pointing toward foul play. Forensic sequencing established this chain: Beverly's blood in McLaughlin's trunk, soil from his vehicle matching terrain near her workplace, voicemail suggesting direct contact the day of her disappearance, cell phone tower data placing McLaughlin near the crime scene during the critical window. Each piece aligned, but investigators remained cautious. Forensic consistency doesn't guarantee courtroom success. Each layer required further reinforcement. The trunk sample needed a full-profile DNA match. The soil analysis, while compelling, needed to rule out alternative sources in the area. Surveillance data remained circumstantial without clearer imagery. To extend their forensic reach, detectives expanded the grid search along the riverbanks north of Earth City. The goal: to locate any physical trace of Beverly beyond the drag marks. This included clothing, personal effects, or bodily remains. 3 days after Beverly Guenther disappeared, the investigation shifted focus from forensic analysis in controlled labs to the unpredictable terrain along the Mississippi River. Physical evidence: blood in the trunk of Scott McLaughlin's vehicle, soil consistent with her workplace, provided direction but not resolution. There was no body, no definitive trace of where Beverly might have been taken after leaving her office. Without a recovery, no homicide charge could hold in court. Detectives ordered an expanded ground search along the river's northern bank, prioritizing areas within a 5-mile radius of the last confirmed cell tower ping from McLaughlin's phone. The search grid, plotted by environmental mapping software, focused on river access points, boat launches, and secluded clearings. These were locations where, if a body had been disposed of, evidence could still remain within reach before winter conditions took hold. Missouri State Highway Patrol's Marine Division assisted in this phase. Water levels along the Mississippi were lower than average for late November, exposing mudflats and embankments that might otherwise have been inaccessible. Cadaver dogs were deployed along these perimeters, trained to detect decomposition even when physical remains were submerged or buried shallow. On November 24th, during the second day of search operations, one of the canine units alerted along a narrow inlet bordered by driftwood and industrial debris. A partial section of torn fabric, tangled in a thicket of brush, was recovered. The material, dark blue polyester, matched the description of the slacks Beverly had been wearing at the time of her disappearance, confirmed through photographs provided by her employer. This discovery initiated a focused sweep of the surrounding area. Search teams employed ground-penetrating radar to identify disturbances beneath the surface, while forensic divers assessed the waterline for submerged remains or additional evidence. Less than 30 yards from the inlet, divers recovered a woman's shoe, heavily worn, consistent in size and style with footwear Beverly was last seen wearing. While these findings were circumstantial, they strengthened the forensic narrative. Each recovered item narrowed the scope of the search and aligned with McLaughlin's movements, as charted by digital forensics. Forensic analysis of the torn fabric yielded trace amounts of blood, insufficient for immediate DNA profiling, but enough to confirm it was human. The material also contained small plant fibers and silt consistent with the riverbank environment, indicating the item had been in place for several days. Simultaneously, lab technicians processed soil samples from McLaughlin's vehicle, alongside fresh samples collected from the inlet site. Comparative analysis revealed near-identical mineral compositions, particularly the ratio of clay to organic debris, linking his car's undercarriage soil to the riverbank. The search continued into the evening hours. Light fading, temperatures dropping, but progress made. A secondary canine alert occurred near a depression in the riverbank roughly 50 yards upstream from the initial find. This time, excavation revealed a shallow grave, poorly concealed beneath a thin layer of mud and river debris. Human remains were recovered, heavily decomposed but intact. The body was female, dressed in partial remnants of office attire, matching Beverly Guenther's description. Identification documents were absent. Initial visual assessment suggested multiple stab wounds to the torso and defensive injuries on the hands, but full autopsy would be required for confirmation. The recovery site was secured immediately. Every inch of the surrounding area documented, photographed, and surveyed for potential secondary evidence. The body was transported to the medical examiner's office in St. Louis for post-mortem examination. At this stage, procedural sequencing aligned. Beverly's blood in McLaughlin's vehicle trunk, soil on his car matching the riverbank, clothing fragments recovered downstream, human remains consistent with the victim's description. Autopsy procedures began early the following morning. The medical examiner documented multiple sharp force injuries, 10 stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. Defensive wounds were present on both forearms and hands. No signs of sexual assault were confirmed, but significant bruising along the upper arms and shoulders indicated forceful restraint prior to death. Toxicology returned negative for alcohol or drugs, consistent with a workplace abduction scenario. Time of death was estimated within a 3-hour window following her last phone activity, placing it between 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. on November 20th. DNA comparison from the blood traces on McLaughlin's vehicle was now fully processed, confirming a match to Beverly Guenther's profile. The chain of evidence solidified. Forensic sequencing, vehicle, soil, fabric, remains, established a direct connection between McLaughlin's car and the recovery site along the Mississippi. By November 25, 2003, the cumulative forensic evidence transitioned the case from investigation to arrest. The recovery of Beverly Guenther's remains, coupled with biological traces in Scott McLaughlin's vehicle and the alignment of digital data, formed the evidentiary threshold required for formal charges. Law enforcement moved forward decisively. Scott McLaughlin was arrested at his residence without incident. The warrant outlined probable cause for first-degree murder, armed criminal action, and evidence tampering. Upon arrival, officers noted that McLaughlin's demeanor remained consistent with prior interviews. Compliant, no outward signs of distress. Standard protocol was followed. Miranda rights were issued, and he was transported to the St. Louis County Police Department for processing. Interrogation commenced within 4 hours of arrest. Detectives initiated with a review of the existing timeline, pressing McLaughlin on the inconsistencies between his stated alibi and the digital data recovered from both his phone and his vehicle's movements. He maintained his position, denying any involvement, denying having seen Beverly on the night she disappeared. However, when confronted with the forensic evidence, specifically the confirmed presence of Beverly's blood in the trunk of his vehicle, his responses shifted. McLaughlin acknowledged that he may have encountered Beverly in the days prior, suggesting the possibility of incidental transfer. This claim, however, was unsupported by the broader forensic narrative. During this session, detectives employed a strategy focused on exposing factual contradictions rather than eliciting emotional responses. They presented the GPS correlation between McLaughlin's vehicle movements and the recovery site along the Mississippi River. His response remained non-committal, reiterating that he frequently drove those areas to clear his head. To further challenge his account, investigators introduced the fabric fragment recovered near the burial site, material matching Beverly's last known attire. Though McLaughlin continued to deflect, his narrative narrowed. He no longer outright denied being near Beverly's workplace or the riverbank, but framed his presence as unrelated. Forensic sequencing guided this interrogation. DNA confirmed blood in McLaughlin's vehicle, cell tower and GPS data contradicting his alibi, physical evidence from the riverbank, clothing, remains. McLaughlin's defense shifted to minimize. He claimed any prior conflict with Beverly was resolved. He downplayed the restraining order as a misunderstanding. These statements contrasted sharply with documented reports of repeated harassment and threats filed months prior by Beverly. While McLaughlin remained under custody, detectives secured a secondary warrant to search his residence in greater depth, focusing on items that could establish premeditation, cutting instruments, clothing, or any documentation suggesting intent or planning. The search yielded a folding knife with traces of what appeared to be blood residue located in a garage storage bin. The knife, approximately 6 inches in length, matched the wound profiles identified in Beverly's autopsy. Lab analysis was expedited. Preliminary tests indicated the residue was human blood, pending full DNA confirmation. Additionally, investigators recovered handwritten notes, tucked within a drawer, referencing Beverly by name. The content outlined grievances, statements expressing frustration about the restraining order, and references to making things right. While not an explicit confession, these writings contributed context to McLaughlin's state of mind. Forensic process overview. Knife recovered matching wound dimensions. Blood traces on knife undergoing DNA confirmation. Handwritten notes establishing emotional context, motive alignment. With this second wave of evidence, the prosecutorial team prepared to move toward formal indictment. The case was no longer dependent solely on circumstantial data. Physical evidence, digital tracking, and McLaughlin's shifting narrative converged. A pre-trial hearing was scheduled, where McLaughlin's defense counsel contested the admissibility of digital location data and the recovery of the knife. Prosecutors, however, argued the chain of custody was clear, and the evidence met legal standards. At this stage, procedural momentum was secured. The burden shifted toward establishing McLaughlin's intent and opportunity, layering in forensic proof with behavioral patterns. By early December 2003, the investigative phase of the Beverly Guenther case reached its procedural pivot point. With Scott McLaughlin in custody, prosecutors began formalizing their case for trial. The evidence collected, biological, digital, and circumstantial, had established probable cause for arrest, but trial proceedings demanded a higher threshold, beyond reasonable doubt. The forensic lab finalized the DNA testing on the knife recovered from McLaughlin's residence. The blood residue matched Beverly Guenther's genetic profile. This weapon's blade length and pattern also aligned with the wound trajectories documented in the autopsy report. The knife became the prosecution's key physical link between McLaughlin and the victim's cause of death. Prosecutors consolidated the forensic sequence for presentation. Beverly's blood discovered in McLaughlin's trunk and on the recovered knife. Soil trace from the undercarriage of McLaughlin's vehicle matching the riverbank burial site. Cell tower records placing McLaughlin's phone near Beverly's workplace and the disposal site during the critical window. Surveillance footage capturing a dark sedan near Beverly's workplace, consistent with McLaughlin's vehicle. Each component on its own could be challenged. Together, they formed a cohesive timeline. The pretrial hearings began in January 2004. Defense counsel filed motions to suppress several categories of evidence: the knife, on grounds of an allegedly overbroad search warrant; the digital location data, citing potential privacy violations; and the recovered voicemail, claiming it lacked relevance to the events of the night Beverly disappeared. These motions were expected procedural tactics. The prosecution countered with the chain of custody logs, outlining how the search warrant for the knife had been specific to objects that could serve as potential weapons. The search warrant had been issued based on the probable cause established by the initial forensic findings. The digital location data had been lawfully obtained through court orders, and the voicemail, while not a confession, demonstrated pre-offense intent. The presiding judge ruled in favor of the prosecution on all counts. The knife, the digital data, and the voicemail would be admissible at trial. While legal maneuvering unfolded in courtrooms, investigative teams continued reviewing ancillary evidence. One critical piece involved phone records spanning the weeks leading up to Beverly's disappearance. Analysis revealed a pattern. McLaughlin had made multiple calls to Beverly, often late at night, sometimes leaving voicemails that were later deleted. Though these were not retrievable in content, the call logs demonstrated ongoing, unwanted contact. In parallel, investigators conducted interviews with McLaughlin's acquaintances. Two former partners described similar patterns of control and harassment. While these accounts could not directly influence the case due to evidentiary limits on prior bad acts, they provided context for the prosecution's theory of behavior escalation. The case timeline was reconstructed in full for courtroom presentation. November 20th, 2003, 4:19 p.m., Beverly sends her last known text message. 6:23 p.m., Beverly's phone activity ceases. 7:12 p.m., surveillance footage records a dark sedan near her workplace. Between 6:30 and 9:30 p.m., time of death established by autopsy. Subsequent days, blood traces, soil evidence, and body recovery tie McLaughlin to the crime scene. The prosecutorial team prepared expert witnesses to explain the forensic findings in detail, ensuring the technical elements were comprehensible to a jury. The forensic pathologist would testify regarding the autopsy results. The digital forensics expert would outline the tower ping data and explain how McLaughlin's movements aligned with key locations. Crime scene analysts would present soil composition comparisons. The trial was scheduled for mid-2004. The court anticipated a multi-week proceeding, given the complexity of forensic evidence involved. Prosecutors finalized their list of exhibits, including photographs of the burial site, diagrams of wound patterns, and location maps overlaying digital data. At this stage, McLaughlin's defense counsel signaled an intent to challenge the prosecution's timeline. They hinted at alternative scenarios, suggesting that Beverly could have met someone else after work that evening. No evidence supported this theory, but it previewed the defense's strategy: create uncertainty where direct witnesses were absent. The trial of Scott McLaughlin opened in the summer of 2004 at the St. Louis County Circuit Court. Jury selection prioritized impartiality, but the case had gained regional attention, largely due to the violence of the crime and the extensive forensic evidence that underpinned the prosecution's strategy. The charges included first-degree murder, armed criminal action, and evidence tampering. The prosecution's objective was to align each piece of forensic data into a timeline that left no room for reasonable doubt. Opening statements adhered to procedural norms. The prosecution outlined its case as a sequence of physical facts: the blood in the vehicle, the matched soil samples, the knife recovered from the defendant's residence, and the digital records tracking his movements on the night of Beverly Guenther's disappearance. They emphasized that the case was not about conjecture or motive, but about corroborated evidence, each layer reinforcing the next. The defense, in contrast, positioned its case around two central points: the absence of direct eyewitness testimony placing McLaughlin at the scene of the crime, and the suggestion that the forensic evidence, while compelling, could be subject to contamination or misinterpretation. They raised the possibility of alternate scenarios, attempting to create gaps in the prosecution's chain of custody and forensic analysis. The prosecution's first witnesses were members of the forensic team. The crime scene technician who processed McLaughlin's vehicle provided testimony on the luminol testing procedures, the identification of blood traces in the trunk, and the chain of custody documentation. These processes were presented methodically, focusing on lab standards and the verification of results. Following this, the DNA analyst testified to the matching profiles between the blood samples and Beverly Guenther. The analysis protocols were described in detail, how samples were handled, processed, and cross-checked against known genetic markers. This portion of testimony served to reinforce the validity of the biological evidence, leaving minimal room for procedural doubt. Digital forensics followed. An expert outlined the defendant's cell tower activity from the evening of November 20th, presenting visual aids that mapped his movements from the vicinity of Beverly's workplace to the burial site along the riverbank. The expert clarified the methodology behind cell tower triangulation, reinforcing the proximity and timing alignment with the window of Beverly's last known activity. One of the trial's pivotal moments arrived with the forensic pathologist's testimony. The autopsy findings were detailed: 10 sharp force wounds to the chest and abdomen, consistent with a bladed weapon of the knife's size and shape, recovered from McLaughlin's garage. The wound patterns suggested an attack from close range, with defensive injuries present on the hands and forearms. The time of death estimate, aligned with digital forensic data, placed Beverly's death within hours of her disappearance. Throughout these presentations, the defense cross-examined each expert, challenging the potential for contamination in sample collection, questioning the reliability of digital data under certain conditions, and implying that the chain of evidence might have gaps. However, each challenge met documented procedural counterpoints, each item logged, tracked, and tested under controlled conditions. The prosecution introduced the handwritten notes recovered from McLaughlin's residence. While not a direct confession, the content reflected ongoing frustration with Beverly Guenther, referencing the restraining order and vague references to ending the conflict. These writings were entered as circumstantial evidence to frame McLaughlin's state of mind in the lead-up to the homicide. Finally, the prosecution called Beverly's co-workers and close associates. Their testimonies reiterated the timeline of harassment, the restraining order filed against McLaughlin, and Beverly's expressed fears in the weeks prior to her death. While not forensic in nature, these testimonies established behavioral patterns, contextualizing the forensic evidence presented earlier. The trial of Scott McLaughlin entered its final phase in late summer 2004. After weeks of forensic testimony, digital reconstructions, and procedural debate, the case now rested on how 12 jurors would interpret the evidence. The prosecution's closing argument focused on the sequence of corroborated facts. They reassembled the chain of events: Beverly Guenther's last known communications, the timeline of her disappearance, the recovery of her remains, and the forensic links to McLaughlin's vehicle, property, and movements. Prosecutors avoided conjecture. Their focus remained procedural: DNA analysis tying Beverly's blood to the trunk of McLaughlin's car and the knife recovered from his garage, soil analysis connecting McLaughlin's vehicle to the burial site, digital forensics placing his phone in the vicinity of Beverly's workplace and the disposal site during the critical window. In the defense's closing, the strategy remained consistent: attack the chain of custody, question potential contamination of forensic samples, and suggest alternate scenarios unsupported by physical evidence. They argued that the absence of direct eyewitnesses created gaps that the prosecution's circumstantial case could not fill. Their emphasis was not on disproving the evidence presented, but on urging the jury to find reasonable doubt in its collection and interpretation. The jury received its instructions shortly after closing arguments. They were tasked with evaluating the weight and reliability of the forensic evidence, not the emotional undertones surrounding the case. Deliberations began with a review of the key forensic findings. The jurors requested multiple exhibits: photographs of the trunk's luminal positive areas, the GPS mapping of McLaughlin's movements, and autopsy diagrams outlining wound patterns. Deliberations lasted 2 days. The jury returned unanimous verdicts: guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of armed criminal action, and guilty of evidence tampering. With a guilty verdict secured, the case proceeded to the sentencing phase. In Missouri, first-degree murder carries the potential for the death penalty. The jury was tasked with determining whether aggravating factors warranted such a sentence. The prosecution presented these factors: the calculated nature of the crime, Beverly's vulnerability given the restraining order, and the premeditation suggested by McLaughlin's handwritten notes. The defense presented mitigating circumstances focused on McLaughlin's background: childhood abuse, long-standing mental health issues, and his expressed intent to transition, arguing these factors diminished his moral culpability. The defense introduced expert testimony on McLaughlin's psychological evaluations, presenting diagnoses of depression and gender dysphoria. During sentencing deliberations, the jury balanced the weight of the aggravating factors against the presented mitigations. After review, they returned with the recommendation for a death sentence. The court upheld the jury's recommendation. McLaughlin was formally sentenced to death by lethal injection. Following sentencing, procedural motions were filed to begin the appeals process, as is customary in capital cases. Defense counsel challenged the sentencing on the grounds of ineffective assistance and sought to reintroduce evidence regarding McLaughlin's mental health that had been excluded from trial. The appellate process was set in motion, beginning what would become a prolonged legal battle over the following years. The legal journey of Scott McLaughlin did not end with the 2004 sentencing. In capital cases, the appeals process is expected, often spanning years. McLaughlin's defense team initiated post-conviction relief motions, centering on claims of ineffective assistance of counsel and failure to fully present mitigating evidence related to his mental health and personal history. These appeals marked the start of a complex legal battle that would extend nearly 2 decades beyond the trial. One central argument in McLaughlin's post-conviction filings was that his counsel at trial had failed to adequately explore and present evidence of severe childhood abuse and mental health struggles. Evaluations conducted during the appeals phase diagnosed McLaughlin with depression, borderline intellectual functioning, and gender dysphoria. His legal team contended that these factors should have been given greater weight during sentencing. In 2016, a federal district court granted McLaughlin's habeas corpus petition, ruling that his trial counsel had been constitutionally ineffective during the sentencing phase. The death sentence was vacated, and McLaughlin was reclassified to life without parole pending further proceedings. The prosecution, however, appealed this decision to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. In 2021, the Eighth Circuit reversed the lower court's ruling, reinstating the death sentence. The appellate court concluded that, while McLaughlin's mitigation evidence could have been presented more effectively, the trial counsel's overall performance met constitutional standards. This reinstatement positioned McLaughlin back on death row at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri. During this time, McLaughlin, who had been known as Scott at trial, began living openly as Amber McLaughlin. The transition process unfolded during incarceration, with McLaughlin identifying as female, undergoing hormone therapy, and presenting as a transgender woman. While McLaughlin's gender identity was not a factor during the trial, it became a central point of discussion during the final years of appeals and clemency petitions. In December 2022, Missouri Governor Mike Parson received a clemency request from McLaughlin's legal team. The petition outlined McLaughlin's history of trauma, mental health diagnoses, and the fact that she was a transgender woman, highlighting this as the first known case where an openly transgender individual faced execution in the United States. The petition argued that these factors warranted commutation of the sentence to life without parole. Governor Parson reviewed the clemency request alongside recommendations from the Missouri Board of Probation and Parole. On January 3, 2023, the governor's office announced the denial of clemency. The execution would proceed as scheduled. That evening, Amber McLaughlin was executed by lethal injection at the correctional facility in Bonne Terre. The process adhered to state protocols. McLaughlin was pronounced dead at 6:51 p.m. No unusual complications occurred during the procedure. Her final statement expressed remorse and love for those she had left behind, without direct reference to the crime. McLaughlin's execution marked a historic first in the United States, the first known instance of an openly transgender person being executed. This fact generated significant public discourse, drawing attention from advocacy groups on both sides of the capital punishment debate. Some argued that the sentence's enforcement highlighted flaws in the criminal justice system's handling of mental health and marginalized identities, while others emphasized the importance of the forensic evidence that tied McLaughlin to Beverly Guenther's murder. Beverly's family, while largely private in the years following the sentencing, issued a brief statement through legal counsel after the execution. They expressed a hope for closure and reiterated their belief in the justice process. The McLaughlin case remains significant in the larger context of American criminal justice. Its procedural journey from arrest through trial to appeals and eventual execution underscored the intersection of forensic science, legal standards, mental health, and emerging social issues. The evidence held firm throughout: blood traces, soil analysis, digital tracking, autopsy results. Each layer built upon the next, sustaining the weight of the conviction across multiple legal challenges. Yet beyond the courtroom, the case became emblematic of larger debates surrounding the death penalty, the treatment of mental health within the justice system, and the complexities introduced by evolving social understandings of gender identity. Cases like this leave behind more than court transcripts and evidence files. They leave questions. How do we as a community ensure that voices like Beverly Guenther's are heard before it's too late? Restraining orders, forensic evidence, legal procedures, all critical, but none replace prevention. If there's one thing I've learned from sharing this story, it's that speaking up matters early and often. What are your thoughts? Do you believe the justice system handled this case as it should? Or do you think more could have been done beforehand? If this video resonated with you or gave you something to think about, share your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from. I love hearing where these stories reach. And if you didn't connect with this video, tell me why. I value every perspective. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more real-life cases that shape the world we live in. Stay informed, stay engaged,